It's almost impossible in Chicago not to make reference to the Harold Washington coalition of the 80s. That's sort of in everybody's mind because it was such a great time in the city's history. It was the first reform, progressive, multiracial administration that opened the doors and really reflected Chicago. Women occupied positions in the cabinet, in the departments like never before. Harold Washington embraced the gay community, gay and lesbian community. He embraced the Asian community, Latinos, of course. It was a great time of real democracy and representation. And so there's a lot of nostalgia. Chicago has changed quite a bit since then. We lost population. With the demolition under the previous administration, the Daley administration, of the public housing developments in Chicago, we lost over 200,000 people, mostly African Americans, who were pushed out to other neighborhoods from where they lived and into suburban communities, especially working class and low income suburban communities. So you had the resegregation and continued concentration of poverty as a result of that. So Chicago is more diverse than it was in 1983. The 83 election produced a lot of racial polarization. There was a lot of fear mongering and panic peddling. If the first black mayor gets elected, the city is going to just cave into the lake. Horrible things would happen, right? The lake levels would rise. I mean, calamity would be ushered in, and nothing of the sort happened, of course. Harold Washington turned out to be a very beloved mayor, and at the time of his death, the outpouring of grief and appreciation of his tenure was truly remarkable. People came to City Hall. He laid in state for 3 days. The lines that formed to see, to pay their respects were really unprecedented in the city's history. All that to say that Chicago's more diverse. The Asian community, for example, has grown significantly. We've made significant gains in terms of the recognizing and accepting and embracing the LGBTQ community. It has a higher profile. It's now citywide. It's not just your old boys town in Chicago. Chicago's Latino community has continued to grow. It's about a third of the city's population. And the conditions are such, because of the aftermath of the recession and the lack of a real economic recovery, that class and inequality and people's knowledge of inequality has come to really change how people view what's important and politics. And that's why the coalition that gave me 34% of the vote on Tuesday is that new coalition that I'm calling the coalition of the 21st century. It's truly much more diverse than the Harold Washington coalition. Harold Washington coalition was, significant, largely African American, some Latino, and then a sprinkling of whites. A lot of progressive Jews were a part of that coalition, electoral coalition. This one is more diverse, more proportional to the population, and it's really the way to go. There isn't the polarization. I received in the February 24th election approximately 40% of the white vote. That hasn't been done by any minority candidate in, I don't know, in 40, 50 years. I received about 26% of the African American vote, but remember that the president came in. Most of Rahm Emanuel's ads were geared at the African American community, and he was hoping that the president would keep his numbers, at the 50+1 level, but it didn't happen. So, the genie's out of the bottle now, and no one can control it. And it's great for democracy, it's great for Chicago, and it's a part of the writing of a new chapter, I think, in terms of where the Democratic Party is going. So it's an exciting time in Chicago politics. Thank you. Sure. Yes, sir.
Could you talk a little more about the destruction of
Oh, it's a terrible chapter in the city's history. Public housing was uh, the plan that resulted in the demolition of most of the public housing units in Chicago, of the high rises, was that they had become intolerable concentrations of poverty and race, and the worst examples of what happens in a city. And it was done with the pretext of wanting to tear down the vertical ghettos and rebuild housing at lower densities and in other parts of the city. However, they embarked on a very aggressive plan to demolish everything, but they didn't replace the units that they had promised to replace. And they essentially forced people out without any real plan to provide housing units for them. As a result, people moved to different parts of the city. Obviously, crime went up in many neighborhoods. A good bulk of African Americans who moved out of public housing wound up in the poorest suburbs. So you had a reconcentration of poverty in suburban communities, low income communities, which was very bad. The worst of it is that recent media reports have shown that the Chicago Housing Authority, it's the agency that gets the federal funding for public housing in Chicago, for the past 4 years has amassed over $440 million that it's sitting on without building the units that are needed to house the former residents of those high rises, for example, and that they've taken some of that money and used it to pay debt service and to fund the pensions of the employees of the Chicago Housing Authority, which are the best funded pension systems anywhere in the country. Those have been the priorities. Instead of building housing, instead of renovating 4,000 units, which are scattered throughout the city, that could have been used for housing homeless people, housing people on the waiting list, they've just sat on these public assets because they received a waiver from the federal government to not have to comply with that building under the guises of being more flexible, to be more creative, more innovative, et cetera, et cetera. These reports just came out within the last week. It is part of the reason why we have the crisis that we have now. It contributes to crime on the street, and it is one more indictment against Rahm Emanuel because he appoints all the members of the Chicago Housing Authority Board. So that's the crisis that we have with respect to low-income housing and affordable housing in Chicago.